On Sunday, July 21st, 2013, a plane carrying Rich Gross, Marta Chase, Larry Rodman, Marilyn Frankel, Rick Eisenberg, Kit Kat Castaneda Mendez and Matt Dyer landed amongst the ice-covered mountain peaks of Knockfock Fjord in Canada. After landing, the group, which consisted of those mostly over the age of 60, set up their camp 150 yards from a shoreline. Despite strong recommendations for those visiting the area to hire licensed Inuit bear guards who were trained to deal with bears and licensed to carry guns, the group instead opted to purchase flare guns, bear spray, and electric fences. The group set up one of these fences around the tents and the other near the area they intended to do their cooking. With the fences sorted, the group prepared dinner, cleaned up, and went to bed by 10:30 p.m. At 4 a.m, Jakub would step out of his tent and notice they weren't alone. Yelling to the group still sleeping in their tents, he would tell them there was a polar bear with its cub on the shoreline 150 yards away. Though they were only a short distance from one of the world's most violent predators, the group was ecstatic to spot a polar bear so soon into their trip. The next day, on Monday, July 22nd, after having breakfast, the group hiked across the grassy hills to explore the area surrounding their camp. Even after spotting a polar bear with its cub and finding the droppings of a black bear, the antlers of a deer, and the skull of a seal, the group continued their hike. By 3:30 in the afternoon, the group, not far from reaching their campsite, stopped by a stream. While Jakub was walking barefoot in the stream, he would hear Matt scream for him to come back. Close to 150 yards away, a polar bear was approaching, but this time it was much larger than the one they had seen earlier. Grouping together, the group attempted to make themselves look big and started making loud noises in the hope of scaring it away. Despite their effort, the bear continued towards them and was now only 50 yards away. With the bear fast approaching, Rich pulled out his flare gun and fired a shot. The group held their breath as the flare shot toward the bear, who remained unfazed by its light and continued forward. It was only when the flare hit the ground and burst in front of the bear that it began to flee in the opposite direction. The group cheered and clapped as the bear retreated, but it only ran a short distance before sitting by a large ledge with a clear view of the camp only 300 yards away. Now that the bear was at a relative safe distance and heavy rain had begun to fall, the group made their way back to the safety of their camp. Most of the group, tired from their hike and their encounter, went inside their tents to sleep. Matt, however, felt too uneasy with their encounters to sleep and instead continued to watch the bear for another hour before going to rest. By 5 p.m, most of the group had exited their tents and started cooking dinner, but all were aware the bear was still nearby, watching them. Over dinner, they ate and laughed, without talking too much about the polar bear still watching them hours after they had crossed paths. Kit Kat felt the bear's reaction to the flare was reassurance they were safe, but Matt, who couldn't shake his unease, suggested they keep watch overnight. However, his suggestion was shot down by Rich, who told him it wasn't necessary because they had an electric fence. Though Kit Kat and Rich appeared unbothered by the fact a polar bear was stalking them, others in the group were not so cavalier. Rick, another group member, unable to sleep, continued to exit his tent to check if the bear was still watching them. Each time he came out, he could see it, still there, still watching. It was only by 1 a.m. he noticed it was gone. Only 2 hours later, at 3:30 in the morning, Rich would be shaken out of his sleep by screaming. From her tent, Marta had seen a polar bear only a few feet away from her. As it began to tear into the tent next to her, its sheer size and power felt much more real. Marta screamed to Rich, who was now out of his tent with his flare gun in hand. Rich aimed his flare gun at the bear, but it was already fleeing and was now 70 feet away from the camp. If there was a moment of relief, it only lasted seconds. In the distance, Rich could see something dangling from the bear's mouth. Matt, the person who had suggested they keep watch overnight, had been asleep in his tent when he was awoken by movement. Opening his eyes, his stomach dropped. 2 paws were swiping through the fabric of his tent. In seconds, the bear was inside, its jaw clenched around his head and pulled him out from his tent. Matt heard his jaw break with the pull and felt the bear's teeth puncture through his head and neck, but he could do nothing but stare at the bear as he was carried away by it. A strange sense of calm fell over him. Without fear or panic, his mind picked up on smaller things, like the fact he'd lost a sock and the fishy smell of the bear's breath. His friends, however, were much more panicked. From its mouth, he could hear them shouting from the campsite. Suddenly, the bear turned, whipping Matt into the air and slamming him into the ground before continuing into the water. From within its jaws, Matt saw the light of a flare pass by before the bear released him from its mouth and fled. Hours after the attack, a helicopter would arrive and take Matt Dyer to the hospital, where they would find he had 2 crushed vertebrae, a crushed jaw, a broken hand, a pierced and collapsed lung, a punctured arm tendon, and dozens of wounds, including a hole in his neck. Despite the severity of his injuries, Matt recovered, with the only long-term effects being the scars from his wounds and a rasp in his voice from the neck puncture. A year after this attack, Matt would return to his old campsite with reporters, and within minutes, see yet another polar bear. On the 25th of July 2015, Sergey Ananov, a helicopter pilot, was halfway through his 6-hour flight from Canada to Greenland when suddenly the tail of his helicopter jolted and he lost power to the blades. As the helicopter shook, Sergey attempted to accelerate, which only resulted in the aircraft leaning to one side. Now on one side, it was apparent to him that he would not be able to continue flying. Sergey was devastated. He was 42 days into a solo attempt to become the first person to circumnavigate the world in a helicopter that weighed less than 1 ton. Switching the helicopter into safety mode, Sergey glided down through a layer of fog. Below, nothing but ocean and ice. In the corner of his eye, he caught a piece of ice big enough for him to land his helicopter on, but unable to reach it, he was forced to land on water. When he hit the water, the tail began to sink and Sergey quickly undid his safety belt and opened the door. The water was freezing, but the adrenaline from the crash lessened the cold. Now outside of the helicopter and in the water, Sergey dived down to retrieve the life raft under his seat in the sinking helicopter. After retrieving the life raft, Sergey found he was only a short distance from a lump of ice big enough to support him. Swimming over and climbing atop it, Sergey watched as his helicopter completely sank into the dark water below. Taking off his survival suit, Sergey emptied as much of the water as he could before putting it back on. The violent wind forced another layer of cold, and to shield him from it, Sergey inflated the raft to use for shelter. As the adrenaline began to wear off, there was a moment of calm. Sergey kicked himself for not trying to retrieve one of the 2 trackers he had stored on the plane. Both his satellite phone and emergency beacon were now descending to the bottom of the ocean. Though he couldn't raise an alarm from his side, Sergey was optimistic one of his friends who were monitoring his progress through the plane's tracker would notice it was now at a standstill. Inside the raft Sergey had inflated, there were a few bottles of water, a small pack of protein bars, and 3 flares. But after the initial crash, it wasn't food or water that worried him. It was the cold now chilling him to his bones and draining him of his breath. Unfortunately, the cold wouldn't be the last of his problems. 4 hours into his stay on his new ice platform, Sergey would be lying on his stomach attempting to retain heat when he would hear something from outside the raft. First, it was heavy breathing, then the crunch of footsteps as they approached his position. Peeking from underneath the raft, Sergey saw a polar bear sniffing the area and walking toward his direction. With his heart beating out of his chest, Sergey decided to do something most people wouldn't dream of. Throwing off the life raft he was under, Sergey charged the bear with raised arms, screaming and roaring at the 1,000-pound bear. His gamble paid off. The bear, surprised and frightened, turned away and ran. This is when Sergey realized his lone ice island had transformed while he was under the raft. The wind had surrounded it with slates of ice and his relative safety had been taken away from him. The bear had fled 80 feet away from Sergey before turning back toward him and sitting on its backside. The 2 locked eyes, both trying to figure out what the other was going to do. Sergey did the only thing he could do in his situation. He continued to scream and roar at the bear from a distance as it sat, watching him. After a minute, the bear stood up and slowly started walking away from Sergey. Even though it was moving away from him, it continued to glance back at him, interested in what it had encountered. Now over 300 feet away, Sergey allowed himself to sit, but the sense of safety was shattered. It could come back at any moment from any direction, and all Sergey could do was sit, watch, and hope he could bluff his way out of dying if it were to return. While contemplating these thoughts, Sergey would hear the sound of a plane flying above and frantically fire one of his 3 flares into the sky. But as soon as it was over him, it was gone, and he knew the pilot hadn't seen his flare. As night approached, Sergey divided his protein bars and water, the thought of sleeping too dangerous to pursue. By the morning, the sound of another plane flying overhead would result in another flare shot, but again, the pilot failed to see it. With the disappointment of another failed rescue, another polar bear would find its way on Sergey's island. Again, Sergey would do the same thing he had done with the first bear and was successful in scaring it away. For the third time, yet another bear would appear, and again Sergey was able to scare it away. As the sun began to set on the second night, the fog lifted, and from a distance, Sergey could see a light. He made the decision to fire his final flare, and this time someone saw it. After 36 hours stuck on ice and an encounter with not one but 3 bears, a helicopter approached, and he was finally rescued. On the 18th of March 2015, Jakub Moravec and 6 of his friends travelled to the Faroe Islands to view the solar eclipse that was due to occur in a few days' time. The island was expecting 1,500 visitors for the eclipse and already contained over 2,000 residents. A week before the eclipse, the island authorities warned any last-minute visitors not to travel there, as all the hotels were booked, and if they were to camp, they were putting themselves in danger of polar bears and the cold. With the understanding that people would camp outside to view it, authorities warned those that did needed to carry firearms to protect themselves. Despite these warnings, Jakub and his friends decided to camp amongst the tourists in tents to view the eclipse. On the night of the 18th, Jakub would awaken to find a polar bear inside his tent, and just in time to feel it begin to bite down on his head. Using his hands to protect his head, Jakub would scream for help, and the cries of warning of a bear would echo throughout the surrounding tents. Those who had brought guns would begin shooting the bear, which did drive it away from Jakub and back out into the snow. Later, the bear would be tracked down by authorities and killed as a result of the attack.